You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
"250 years after it was written, the Declaration of Independence is still held as one of the most beautiful, eloquent, and powerful political texts of all times, giving a sense of purpose and patriotism to every red-blooded American and a source of hope and aspiration for the world over, declaring that all men are created equal." I am your host, Josh Lewis, and joining me in this conversation is Professor of History Brad Birzer, the Russell Amos Kirk Chair in American Studies at Hillsdale College, whose latest book takes a deep dive into the spirit of 1776, what exactly colonial Americans were thinking, and what led to the decision to break with Great Britain, declare our own independence, and start a new nation, as described in the immortal words of Abraham Lincoln, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. These words are just as important and as alive today as they were 250 years ago. The great American experiment can only succeed to the degree we strive for a more perfect union, seeking to uphold this founding vision. And in this conversation, Dr. Birzer helps us unpackage just what exactly that vision was, how it was stitched together, and how it was given life in this remarkable document, the Declaration of Independence. Now, since we're coming right off the heels of Independence Day, and this would be very apropos for the conversation, I'll give you guys a little musical interlude right before the conversation. I'm by no means a professional pianist, and this was not professional recording equipment, but I still wanted to try to set the proper mood by playing America the Beautiful. The first time through played traditionally, the second time we get a little bit more jazzy, as arranged by Jim Hammerly. And after that, we will begin the conversation with Dr. Brad Birzer. Brad, I don't know how long ago it was we last had you on when we talked about Russell Kirk. It's been years, many years, and I should have had you back sooner, but you have written a new book, The Declaration of Independence, a radical experiment in liberty. And this is apropos, of course, of our 250th anniversary. So I want to welcome you back on Saving Elephants as we go through this very interesting book of yours.
Thanks so much, Josh. I'm really glad to be back. Even if it has been years, I still have very good memories. In fact, when I told my wife just a little bit ago, I said, I'm going up on a podcast with Saving Elephants. She said, "Oh, that's that young man you like so much."
Oh,
was
wow.
like, yes. So you're kind of a family legend. So
Well,
this
that's
is great.
wonderful.
And of course I follow you on social media and you put up with me on social media. And so it's very good. So anyways, seriously, thank you, Josh.
Well, I will definitely say, as social media goes, you are not the hardest person to put up with. There's a long list that would precede you before before it had
I
to.
I I have the tendency to be a little obnoxious, and which is funny because in person I'm not really that way, but for some reason social media just brings it out of me,
It
and
does for all of us.
I'm sarcastic and not always very gentle, and but yeah. Anyway, thank you.
Well, there's a lot of people on social media who are not a little obnoxious. They're a lot of obnoxious. So I can certainly tolerate that. I want to read here from in the acknowledgments of your book. I'm going to begin here. You write, I, referring to yourself, I very much adore George Washington, John Adams, and especially Thomas Jefferson and Edmund Burke. And then skipping on says, to me, Jefferson really is the embodiment of America, and America is the manifestation of Jefferson's mind, spirit, in all that is good and bad. Now I'm going to go back to that first sentence. Very much adore Washington, check, Adams, check, Jefferson, check, and then you throw Edmund Burke in there. Now,
Yeah.
I know that you and I were, mutual fans of Russell Kirk and the Edmund Burke trajectory. You have been around Conservatism Inc. long enough. In fact, I'm going to even throw in here, as I mentioned, the subtitle of the book, A Radical Experiment in Liberty. I have to believe that you would know putting a word like radical and wedding Jefferson and Burke in the same sentence is going to raise some eyebrows somewhere. So can you help
Good.
explain the enigma of Brad to me? Like, how do you square that circle?
Yeah, no, I mean that is in many ways kind of a perfect reflection of my own soul. But I'll put it this way. I mean, Edmund Burke's incredible for all kinds of reasons. I mean, he's truly one of the greatest men of his generation. And I often, when I talk with my students, I will talk in very mythic terms, and I tell them that I'm being mythic here. But when I look at what was going on in 1776 up through, well, really 1775 up through 1783, I really do see George Washington and Edmund Burke as the twin pillars of Atlantis. That is, they are really upholding the traditional understanding of Western civilization. And we often forget as Americans, and I think this is to our shame, that Burke is just as important for us in England as Washington was here in America. Burke was he was treasonous. He
Yeah.
was so much in favor of the American Revolution, and he defended the rights of Americans, the rights of our Continental Congress, the rights of our Continental Army, in ways that could have easily thrown him in jail or even seen his execution. And he never backed down. So I admire Burke so much for being our great defender on the other side of the Atlantic. Jefferson's more problematic. When you look at someone like Edmund Burke, Burke is right on slavery. He's right on the rights of Asian Indians. He's right on the rights of Roman Catholics. He's right on basically any kind of minority group you can think of. He's willing to defend their integrity. And when we look at Thomas Jefferson, you see a very different kind of figure. And I do love Jefferson. There's no question about that. But it doesn't mean that I love every aspect of him. And I
Right.
think as Americans, we need to recognize that not only was he incredibly gifted, when I die, God tells me that Jefferson was the smartest man ever born on American soil. I'm not going to be shocked, but certainly I wouldn't consider him a moral exemplar, especially with his incredible desire to end slavery legally, but his absolute inability to free his own slaves. That's a difficult position. And I think of that, and I think of America, and not to get too political here, Josh, but think about just a couple of weeks ago. We had this moment, if I remember right, it was a Monday night. and we had this moment where Artemis circled the dark side of the moon. And being 58, being a child of the early or the very late 1960s, the moonshot means everything to me. And I think this is the kind of thing I'm happy to pay money for. My taxes, if they're going to go anywhere, let them go to NASA. Let's go to the moon. Let's go to Mars. I'm totally in favor of that. But if you remember, we had that beautiful moment. And then the next morning we woke up and we had President Trump tweeting that by the end of the day, Iranian civilization would cease to exist.
Yeah.
And I thought, and again, I'm not trying to be political here, but I thought, my gosh, that's Thomas Jefferson right there. The brilliance, Lewis and Clark, and then the evil, slavery, right? And not that what Trump was doing was slavery, but oh my gosh, if we take just war theory into account, we don't have the right to wipe out a civilization, no matter how wrong they are. So, I mean, those are the kinds of things. And so when I say Thomas Jefferson is America, I mean that at our best and at our worst.
Yeah, I often put Jefferson and Hamilton on the same plane as like devastatingly brilliant and occasionally crazy.
Yeah,
In some of the ways
And,
they
and
would, in some of their thoughts or miscomings.
right. And so you also asked about radicalism. I don't
Hmm.
know if you want to get into that now, Josh, but yeah, I
Well,
will admit
I
that.
tell you what. Let me preempt
Yep,
that with maybe another
sure.
question because I do want to get into it. It's right. You are to mention slavery if we're going to begin to list, let's say, the sins of Jefferson. Right. That needs to be at the top of the list. But I, and I want to say that to get it out of the way because I want to talk about that a little later in the conversation. But I want to return to when I have difficulties wedding Burke and Jefferson in the same sentence. And I, count me as who's got two thumbs and loves Jefferson. This guy, I think, is a great American. I think he had, you can't improve upon the text of the Declaration of
Right.
Independence. But let me just ask you: is there an incongruity between how Jefferson viewed natural rights and how Burke views natural rights? And is there a sense in which the Jeffersonian approach, let's say shorn of all the other mitigating factors of your John Adams and your
Right.
James Madisons,
Yeah.
just Jefferson wholesale, and he goes on to like venerate the French Revolution sort of thing?
Right.
Is there a sort of radicalism in Jefferson that is incompatible with the inherited rights of, say, a John Adams or an Edmund Burke?
Yeah, so let's just be blunt about this. We know that Edmund Burke also believed in natural rights. He says this
Sure,
several times.
sure.
And but his idea of natural rights is much more mysterious in the best way. And I say that from a Christian perspective. His idea of natural rights is it's a mystery from God. And the idea that Jefferson, for example, could actually know what those rights are and to say, well, they're life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, Burke would reject that completely. He would say, look, these are things we know exist and we honor them and we cherish them, but by listing them, we degrade them.
Hmm.
And so they remain much higher for Burke than they do for Jefferson. But I would say this about Jefferson: Jefferson's view of natural rights is higher than John Locke's. John Locke's very basic: life, liberty, and property. But when Jefferson makes that pursuit of happiness, he's making it very Aristotelian, and it's actually verging on the Christian in ways that I don't think Locke ever would have anticipated or understood. So I would see it more as Locke presents this. But remember, even Locke is getting this from the Jesuits from 100 years earlier, right? Bellarmine and Suarez and De Marina, and
Hmm.
really from Aquinas and before that. So there's a long Catholic tradition of this. And then Locke takes it, he secularizes it for the most part. Locke's not an atheist, but we wouldn't call him an Orthodox Christian
Right.
either by any means. And then you have Jefferson, who is a deist, a solid deist. But then you have Burke, who's a very serious Christian. And
Hmm.
so I think it really does go almost from the secular pagan up to the Christian in the way that we look at it. And so, yeah, I think there's a continuity there. And I certainly, as a Roman Catholic, I have no problem believing in natural rights. They make perfect sense to me. But I don't know if I can delineate them. And if I do, I might be cheapening them in some way.
And I would argue Jefferson certainly got the close. If delineating natural right is an impossibility, I think the closest we've ever gotten is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? It's certainly
Right.
a step
Right.
above, say, the French, what liberty, equality, fraternity,
Yes.
or
Yes.
the socialist or Marxist models of
Right.
understandings of rights. And I,
But you could.
oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, but you can definitely see why Jefferson could go wrong too, right? That it's just not as grounded as Burke is,
Right.
and so it can become kind of crazy, like with the French Revolution. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Josh.
No, I think we're kind of on the same wavelength there. That's why I said the mitigations of, say, your Adams and your Madisons, and not that they were
I,
there holding Jefferson down, but I think they used Jefferson's very, let's call it, radical idea, and ran it through a
yeah,
sort of conservative filter in a manner that, the French would have benefited if Robespierre or, well, maybe that's a bad example, Lafayette, let's say,
yeah,
had a more mitigating
right,
filter. Um,
yeah.
let me ask, because I could spend the entire conversation stuck on natural rights, which would likely bore whatever audience is going to remain with us.
I'd like it.
Yeah, exactly. I know, but I don't know how much they're going to want to hang with it.
little inside baseball there.
Yeah. Let me turn then to, let's get out of the acknowledgments and into the introduction. We're making some progress here in your book.
Sure.
And I think it's in the introduction. You juxtapose, rightly, in my view, Woodrow Wilson as kind of having this departure from the founding vision.
Right.
And I don't know that that's necessarily the thing a Wilsonian or Wilson himself would disagree with. I mean, he was the first American president, to my knowledge, that criticized the founders. Not kind of criticize them on the basis, not that they were wrong, perhaps for their time, but almost more of a, well, we now know better,
Mhm.
and we're now in a
Right.
position to kind of put the
Very
experts
well
in charge.
stated.
So I'm curious, because I've heard two different views here. If we take let's say a Wilsonian progressivism, one view sort of says, well, look, if you, and let's get off Jefferson because I don't want to beat up on him too much. If you take Thomas Paine, who I would say is the more radical version of Jefferson's
Sure.
ideas, he shows up in the French Revolution, right? He's helped with the revolution here in the United States, and then he shows up in France, because that's what we got to do. We've got to turn the world upside down, get rid of these monarchs, and establish liberty. And there are some who would argue, look, you can draw a direct line from the radicalism found in Paine that essentially says prior generations have nothing of value to offer us if they are wrong. Our rights are essentially something we can assert, we can define through a positive lens, let's say, and you can eventually end up in a sort of a Wilsonian court, and therefore that kind of progressivism is homegrown American. It's just as intertwined with the conservatism of our past. And then, of course, there's the other, I think the more recent example, if I'm not mistaken, Supreme Court Justice, I was going to say Thomas Sowell. That's that he were on the Supreme Court. That'd be interesting. Clarence Thomas, yes. The other Thomas.
Yes.
Forgive me. I think you know where I'm going with this. In the lecture he delivered rather recently, essentially says the Wilsonian progressivism, and I don't think he was saying all progressive thought, because we have to define what we mean by progressive. Wilsonian progressivism was imported artificially from essentially German universities in the United States, and this was never part of America. And so it's kind of a long-winded way of saying, where do you stand on that? Is criticism of the founding vision, as Jefferson and Adams say understood it, is that American or is that completely foreign?
No, it's definitely not foreign. Maybe certain things are. Wilson is definitely importing some foreign ideas, and many of the progressives were so deeply influenced by Germanic philosophy, especially Hegel and Fichte and a few other figures. And so what they do, and this is not really meant to criticize Darwin, but what the progressives do is they take Darwin, and because there's this evolutionary adaptation to things, they believe that there are these moments in the past that we have gotten beyond. And that's why at least in the book, I try and juxtapose what Woodrow Wilson says, this progressive vision, let us evaluate everything as Darwin would. I try and juxtapose that with Calvin Coolidge, and Calvin Coolidge saying, no, we've reached a finality here. Once you say all men are created equal, that's it. There's no more argument to be made.
There's no more progressing beyond that.
Yes, absolutely. The only thing you can do is make that real. That's all there is at that point. And that, I mean, there's a radicalism partly in what Calvin Coolidge is saying because it's radically in favor of human dignity. And when I think of someone like Woodrow Wilson, I'm not surprised, and I'm by no means a progressive in any way, shape, or form,
Hmm.
but I'm not surprised that Wilson hated blacks and he hated Jews and he hated immigrants. It seems par for the course because he's thinking in these evolutionary terms
Yeah.
and he's really coming into a very bigoted understanding. The only thing that matters for Woodrow Wilson is essentially the white Anglo-Protestant world. That is that thing around which everything else revolves. And that I think is, I mean, I'm sure you agree with me, Josh, but that's just incredibly dangerous. But think about progressivism as a theory. Progressivism always posits conflict. It's always about the haves versus the have-nots.
Yeah.
And it's the thesis versus the antithesis and the
Hmm.
creation of a synthesis. And that's just not, my vision of history says, it's 8 billion people making 8 billion decisions every second of life. And we're moral and we're ethical, or at least we strive to be. And those decisions add up. And, I would go so far, and I've been accused of sounding like a hippie here, but I would go so far as to say it's love that moves
Hmm.
us from one thing to another, not conflict. It's
Hmm.
it's giving up one's time or talents. It's giving up, some aspect of ourselves to another. That's what moves history forward. And so, I have a radically different vision than what the progressives see. So that's my bias, Josh. That it's even hard for me to understand where they're coming from. But yeah, I think the Wilsonian vision is a very dangerous vision. And I don't think it can lead to anything but bigotry and violence.
Yeah, the best thing I can say of Wilson is thankfully he was such a rabid racist that these
Yeah.
days both the left and the right can beat up on the guy. And
Right.
in
Right.
hopes that the left could say, well, if we hate him for that reason, maybe he got some other things wrong too. Maybe there's an opening there we can have a conversation on. But
No,
uh
that's right. That would be great.
that would be great. So, moving into the actual book, out of the acknowledgments and the introduction, I want to get this out of the way because I know it's commonplace in American parlance, and especially, I even heard The Rest is History, a podcast that does very well. Two British blokes, and they're wonderful, and they, they may have just been saying things sort of tongue in cheek, but they had made a reference to the American Revolution and essentially boiled it all down to a bunch of aristocratic landowners that didn't want to pay their taxes, and that
Mm,
explained the entire thing. I understand why a surface level, let's say, review of what exactly the colonists were so upset about could probably most easily be explained. Well, they just didn't want to pay taxes because who does? But what is a more appropriate understanding, let's say, of how those original colonists, prior to making a decision to break with Great Britain, what was their actual beef about taxation?
yeah. Let me put it this way, Josh. Yes, there were some landed aristocrats, and yes, they had a high role in all of this. But remember, the Continental Army is not made of aristocrats. It's made of farmers.
Hmm.
And when we look at the population at the time, 97 to 99% of all whites are farmers. That's what they're doing. These are people who've come in off the farm. They've been hunting all their life. They know their guns, and they're not going to put up with the British trying to rule them. I think libertarians are wrong about this as well. And I would put myself very much in a libertarian camp overall. But the libertarians almost always argue that the American founding was a tax revolt. And that's just not true. There's no doubt that the Americans didn't like taxes, but they taxed themselves. They had no problem raising taxes for their colonies or for their communities as long as they were represented. What they resented was the idea that anyone could take from us our revenue without our consent. And they're furious about that. So it's not a tax revolt. And if it had been a tax revolt, they failed miserably because it's much more expensive to run your own country than to be a colony. And so, of course, taxes go up immeasurably after the revolution. That's not what they're fighting about. They really are fighting about representation. But I would take it even farther than that. And something that, when you look at the Declaration, it becomes obvious, but you have to read the grievances. And one of the things that the thing that starts the revolution has nothing to do with taxes. And it has nothing to do with representation. What starts the idea and movement towards the American Revolution is the idea that the British can mess with our law courts. We were absolutely a common law people. We believed in a right to a trial by jury and the right to habeas corpus and the right to non excessive bail and the right against cruel and unusual punishment. These were all the right to be innocent until proven guilty. These things are older than Christianity. This is when the Christian missionaries met the Anglo-Saxons. They were already practicing all of this. And so that's what we believed in. And the British hated it because they couldn't control us. And so
Mm-hmm.
what they tried to do right after the French and Indian War, they started implementing admiralty courts, basically taking naval law and putting it on the land. And so there were no trials by jury. Instead, you would have three judges who were determining things with no check on them at all. And the Americans are furious about this. And it really is, it's the beginning of the end when they try to implement those law courts in America. And, I think it's unfortunate, Josh, and again, I speak from a kind of libertarian conservative perspective. We talk about natural rights. I want us to talk about common law rights. Imagine the difference. Think about what goes on in an English speaking world. Would you rather be arrested in Toronto or Mexico City? And just think about why for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Mexico has a constitution that is almost word for word identical with the US Constitution, but they don't have common law. And so if you are arrested in Mexico City, you are guilty because the government wouldn't mess with you otherwise. Toronto, it's just the opposite. They don't have a constitution at all, but they believe in common law. You're innocent. And obviously there's a language difference, so it would be easier
Sure,
in
sure.
English speaking. But I'm discounting that. Let's say that we're all speaking the same language. I don't want to be arrested in Mexico City. And I think it's really important. And I see people struggle with this when they're arguing. They'll say things like, well, I don't like Sharia law because I'm not Muslim. The reason not to like Sharia law is because it's overturning common law.
Yeah.
It wouldn't matter if it's Muslim or Hindu or whatever. It's like, no, common law is a superior, and I don't have a drop of English blood in me.
Mm-hmm.
Not at all. So there's no race or ethnic pride here, but I am so proud to be born under an English law system because it's the best. And it's one reason if England joins the EU, they're going to lose that. The EU is all Roman law. It's all top down, and
Mm-hmm.
the English tradition is all bottom up. Our law is a representation of our will, not from authority, but from experience. And that I know I'm being really Burkean here, but
That's
that's
okay. It's a safe
yeah,
place.
yeah. I mean I really think I'm very proud of the Declaration, but I'm equally proud that we're under a common law system. And I think from anyone who believes in human dignity, there's never been a better law system than common law.
This is a profound ignorance on my part, but does the common law system exist outside of the Anglosphere, or is it a uniquely British and British former colony experience?
Yeah, all the Scandinavian countries have a form of it.
Okay.
So it's all in the northern Germanic tribes. So basically, anywhere there were Northern Germans, Anglo-Saxons being Northern Germans, they had it, and it's almost entirely gone now. Even England barely remembers its common law, and we in America are very quickly moving towards administrative law, and we have been since the Progressive period. So we basically spent the last 130 or 40 years overturning common law as well. And that's one reason someone like Justice Thomas, who, despite being black, would have been
Mm-hmm.
normal in the 19th century. Obviously, his blackness would not have been for a Supreme Court justice. But now when he speaks, he seems pretty wild and out there. But he's
Mm-hmm.
actually just speaking like a traditional Englishman would have spoken for most of English history.
There's so much we could talk about here, but I want to park here for just a second because I don't want to be lost on the audience. Can you give us a let's say sort of elevator pitch between here in the United States, what is common law? What is administrative law? So the
Sure.
average listener can say, "Oh, I see what the difference is between those
Okay.
two things."
Yeah, I'll give you a practical example. I live in Hillsdale, Michigan. The next town up is called Jonesville. It's 5 miles away. There's a road that connects. It's a little windy road that connects the two towns. And for a long time, up until about a decade ago, there was no speed limit. And so in between here and there, you'd get people driving 55, you get people driving 20. And what the police did, they put up radar guns at either end of the road and they measured what was the average speed. And the average speed was 35. That became the law. Now that's common law. Common law says we've gotten experience, we know what this means, this is what the people do. It's a law that represents the people, totally different than if the state of Michigan had just said, no, that's going to be 35 no matter what. That would be administrative law where it's imposed from above. And you get natural law thinkers like Cicero, the great Roman Republican, or even St. Augustine later, or Thomas Aquinas. And they really do make this distinction. They say, look, law is either emergent or it is imposed. And so even a Republican legislature, small r Republican, even a
Mhm.
Republican legislature, its real job is to measure what a people is doing, not to impose its will upon the people, but to reflect what that will is. And so this is the huge difference. Almost all of continental Europe is under what's called Roman law, Justinian law. That's law from above.
Mhm.
Whereas all of the English speaking peoples and the Germanic tribes, it's all emergent. So, another example of this would be King Alfred, the first great English king. And when he would look at the law, he would always say, I, as king, have absolutely no right to make law. I can only inherit law from my ancestors and with my Congress pass judgment on it. So a king in the English rule cannot make up laws.
Mhm.
Traditionally, that's common law. Does that make sense, Josh?
It does, and I'm going to ask a follow-up. Again, I don't mean to
Sure.
park here, but this is such an
No,
important
this is
conversation, I
great.
think. So here's my follow-up conversation. Based on the definition you just gave me, which works, I think it works. How do we make a leap then from, okay, I get the difference between we've established through emergence 35 mile an hour speed limit. That's what the people sort of do. Rather than a top down, some sort of a potentate or administrator just saying, I
Right.
declare this to be 35 miles an hour just because, I don't know, who knows, whatever their reasoning is.
Right. Exactly.
But then what happens when we explode this to, okay, the American South for a good many years has enslaved
Oh,
African Americans.
yeah.
Isn't that common law? What
No.
trumps it? Because at that point, we need to revert and say, well, now, wait a minute. Now we do need let's call them an administrator, essentially
Yeah.
imposing something outside of the local emergence. What are
Yeah.
the limitations there for, I guess, what
Yeah.
we call
No,
common law?
that's a great question, Josh. And there's actually a relatively easy answer. Slavery was utterly illegal under the common law. And that's one reason that Southerners would keep so many guards around courthouses. Because truly, if a Black person entered into a common law court, they were given rights. That's what's
Mm,
going on with Dred Scott. That's what's going on in those law cases. And so common law is actually, it has to be by definition anti-slavery because there's no common if you have slavery. There's no common at all. You have
yeah.
hierarchy. And the common law is radically egalitarian.
Okay. That makes sense. And of course, I know we could also have an entire conversation about appeals to natural rights and are they, well, again, I, I'm going to get us off on a 30-minute tangent. So let
Oh,
me
no, this
return
is
us.
great. I
Let
love
me
this.
return us to the conversation at hand, the declaration here. So this is kind of a curiosity of my part. I've noticed that a good many of the complaints, if you will, prior to 1776, all seem to be directed at the British Parliament. Parliament is doing this. Parliament is passing the Intolerable Act and the Stamp Act and the Tea Act.
Right.
When you get to the Declaration, they don't mention Parliament. It's all about King George, who, as you point out in your book, John Adams didn't like the fact it was essentially accusing this guy of being a tyrant. So that's taken a little too far. So what gets us from Parliament is doing it, kind of a notion of if only the czar knew, kind of that mentality of the guy in charge is fine, he just doesn't know the truth, to no, it's
Right.
actually the guy in charge that we're upset with.
Yeah, again, great question, Josh, and it's a complicated answer. The easy answer is this: America never believed in Parliament. Never. There was never a time that we respected Parliament because we didn't believe that Parliament created us, helped us, sustained us. We believed that the legislature of Virginia took care of Virginia, and the legislature of Rhode Island took care of Rhode Island. And so, in the same way that the legislature of Virginia could not legislate for London, London cannot legislate for Virginia. And so the thing that holds the empire together, and they didn't always call it an empire. Often they would call
Sure.
it a commonwealth, which is the same thing as a republic. It's decentralized, right? But you have a king. And so the Americans constantly appealed to the king. And that was fine when it was George II, because George II loved us. He treated us extremely well. He never intervened at all. But then you get George III in. He's arrogant, he's cocky, and he's headstrong. And he wants his will being done. He's an ego, and he wants his will being done. And we traditionally, because we always have, we appeal to him, and we appeal to him, and we appeal to him. And we keep saying to him, get your parliament under control. That's your job, to restrain that parliament. And the king not only does he not restrain parliament, he keeps giving parliament more power. And so there's this moment, and it's hard to find an exact time when, but sometime between the summer of 1774 and the Declaration of Independence on July 4th of 1776, sometime we decide the king is no longer our ally. But and this, if you had 20 historians on this podcast, we'd have 20 different views of when that was. My sense, Josh, is it's better to push that date closer to July 4th rather than away from July 4th. And you find someone like Jefferson, even as late as the fall of 1775, Jefferson writes in a personal letter that he's very hopeful we will reconcile with Britain. So it really is, and it becomes this moment and where things just suddenly become crazy, really starting around January 9th with the publication of Common Sense. There's just this change of attitude. And earlier on January 5th, New Hampshire had declared its independence. By the time Congress declares independence on July 4th, there have already been 75 declarations of independence in the American colonies.
Wow.
Some at the state level, some are absurd. I mean, I think they're great. They tell us a lot about America. But for example, there was a grand jury that met, and 12 of these guys, and what do? They vote that we're no longer under Britain. There were Presbyterian churches. The New York Fire Department declared its independence from Britain. So don't get me wrong, it's not all at the colonial level.
Right.
Sometimes, but that's also it, Josh, this is deeply American. That, well, what is my government? Well, my government is me and the 50 other neighbors I have. That's our government. I mean, we just get together and vote. That's what we do. And that's so utterly American. I mean, you think about something like the First Continental Congress, what legal right did they have to meet? They had no legal right, except it was the will of the people. And that keeps happening over and over again, all the way. Even, think about the Constitutional Convention. What legal right did the Constitutional Convention have to meet? They didn't have any at all. But they meet and they say, oh, here's our Constitution. Will you ratify it? Sure enough, we do. And now that's the law of the land. But nobody decreed it. It was a bunch of guys who got together and said, yeah, let's make this law. And that takes us back to our previous comment, Josh. That's common law, right? That's not George Washington decreeing anything. That's us saying, no, this is how we make our law. We decide. And that, I've got a pet peeve about all of this. To me, is the brilliance of a republic. That's what we are. A republic is a community of communities. No, it's not the democracy, one man, one vote. It's a community. It's my neighborhood, my church, my voluntary association, my family, those kinds of things. And I just think it's genius.
It does seem, it is disheartening because as a as a classical conservative, let me say, it seems like it is an act of restoration to even use the vocabulary necessary to describe these
No,
things.
I
Uh,
know.
and,
I
and and
know.
even
I
for
mean,
myself, who believes this, it's like you have to
I
cultivate it. And so, good grief, what about a person who's hearing this for the first time? Like, what are you two talking about?
I know. I mean, we throw around the word democracy so often.
Yeah,
And it's just, it frustrates me because we're not a democracy. We are a republic. We have a democratic element, but we're a
sure.
republic and it's a different thing. I think it's a higher, more noble thing.
Yes, yeah. Higher and noble doesn't describe our current political moment, I
Well,
suppose,
no,
but
no,
we can
that's right.
we
That's
can
right.
aspire to it. Let me ask about we're talking politics. Let's talk religion. Uh,
Yeah.
you're a confessional Catholic. I'm a Protestant. I thought it was really interesting reading your book through realizing it was coming through a Catholic lens, because I did not know this, the degree to which the Quebec Act seem to really rile people
Right.
up. Now
Oh,
we hear about
yeah.
this in high school. The Stamp Act and the Intolerable Act and kind of what those are, and the Tea Party and all this. And I'm trying to think of how to put this, because I'm one who I venerate our founders. I think they were wonderful, brilliant men and women, but they were imperfect. And there were certainly, I think the left occasionally gets it right, the way in which they pick apart things. Well, what about this? Like, sometimes I think there's an overcorrection, if you will, within conservatives to try to say everything they did was wonderful and perfect. And to me, it was kind of interesting reading about the Quebec Act, which I'll have you explain to us here in a moment, in that I kind of got a sense this was a more odious sense of rebellion against the crown among the American. Now, we're not talking about higher principles. We're talking about those darn Catholics. We don't want them to infiltrate the United States. Is that maybe a fair reading of sort of a proto
Totally
no
fair.
nothing party, kind of a proto populist?
No, let me temper you on that.
Okay,
These people, and I don't think it's. I mean, it is bigotry. There's no question about that. But let's put it in perspective for a moment. When we're looking at America, and this is where I think liberal historians get this very wrong. They love talking about the Enlightenment and how much the Enlightenment influenced America. There were four Enlightenment guys in America, and that's it. There's Thomas Jefferson, there's Ben Franklin, there's Benjamin Rush, and there's Thomas Paine. Now, they matter. They're hugely
yeah,
important. But if you would walk up to 99 out of 100 people on the street, they wouldn't have a clue what the Enlightenment was or what it was about. What they are, and again, I do say this as a Catholic,
yeah.
they are the most Protestant Protestants in the world. America is absolutely 99%, almost 100% Protestant. And
Hmm.
think about what that means, the good of that. They don't like authority, right? And
Hmm.
I mean, I respect that. Even as a Catholic, I respect that
You're a
in a healthy
libertarian
dose,
Catholic.
right? Well, yeah, in healthy doses, right? It can be taken too far. They also are literate. Americans, white Americans are the most literate people in the world at the time of the founding. They read all the time. And they don't just read Calvin's Institutes or look at their Geneva Bible. They read the classics. They read Cicero and they read Aristotle and they read Livy and Tacitus. They are incredibly well educated. So here's my point, and this is the downside, but it's also very important. They don't like Catholics because I don't think they have a proper understanding of Catholicism at all. I don't think they even know what Catholicism is. But in their minds, Catholicism is everything wrong in the world. It's evil, it's regressive, it's sinful, it's about ignorance. No, I mean, I just don't think that's true. But that's what they thought. And
Hmm.
so it really matters that they have this kind of mythic understanding. And Josh, let me backtrack for a second as well. Much of their understanding of common law is mythic as well. It's not rooted in fact, it's a story. It's a story they tell themselves. And this whole Anglo-Saxon story of Hengist and Horsa settling in 450 in England, and that's what the Americans are doing. They are settling America just like the Anglo-Saxons had settled the the British Isles, right? It's not all factually right, but it's mythically so real to them. And so, yeah, when the Quebec Act is passed in June of 1774, what it does two things. Number one, it allows for Roman Catholics to have bishops. And again, let's put this into context. Not a single Protestant bishop had ever stepped on American soil. The very term bishop for most Americans, even among the Anglicans who have bishops, a bishop was worse than a king, because the king can tell you how to rule yourself, but a bishop tells you what to do on Sunday morning. That's utterly evil, right? So even the Protestants would never have a bishop. So the idea that the Quebec Act says, oh, you Catholics can have bishops, man, it's not. And so, number one, they're bishops. Number two, they're Roman Catholic bishops. And so this is just outrageous to Americans. And the second thing, which is more practical, is that Canada, and I love telling my students this. You think about a map of North America. We start at the Atlantic and we go to the Pacific, and north is at the top. That's not the way maps worked in the 18th century. St. Lawrence and Quebec would be at the bottom of a map, and Montreal would be at the top of the map. And that's why places like Michigan and Illinois were called Upper Canada. That's what we were. And so for the Quebec Act, Upper Canada was given to Canada rather than to the American colonies. And so you've got the double whammy. Number one, bishops. Number two, the Catholics are getting the Great Lakes. And so they're deeply offended by this. That is passed, if I remember right, it's June 18th. I may be off a day or two, but that's passed in Parliament, end of June. News of that reaches America about August 1st. On September 5th, the first day of the Continental Congress. There's no accident on that timing. So that's what pushes everybody over the edge. And it had all built up, but it was that Quebec Act. And people just said, holy Moses, no way. And again, we don't think about this. When George Washington's troops ran into battle, their war cry was no king and no pope.
Interesting.
So, and again, there's no chance the Pope is going to show up in America, but that's what they hate. And again, it's mythic, and that's what moves us, Josh. We're not, as human beings, we're not moved by facts. We're moved by stories, and those were the stories they were telling themselves.
There's so many venues in this conversation that I'm tempted to get onto an entire, talk about Catholic integralism or something completely afield of what we're here for. I appreciate the passion by which you responded to that question, but for the interest of time and doing the book some justice, I want to move to. I had the good pleasure of having. I believe you know him. I think you mentioned him in your acknowledgments. Hans Eichhold, the historian. In his excellent book, Harmonizing Sentiments, another very pro-Jeffersonian book. I'm not necessarily anti-Jefferson, but I always feel a little bad when I get I always feel like I need to at least acknowledge that there are some excesses in Jefferson. But wonderful book. I think he did a very good job. The title of the book, Harmonizing Sentiments, probably captures well his overall thesis, that being that there are multiple strands, ideas, myths, if you will, kind of you're saying in the ether of the American people, and that Jefferson didn't originate. I mean, he did. It was an original document, but he essentially attributed it to what he did was he pulled all this stuff together and wrote it down. And so from that, we have, I know sometimes there's a debate who was responsible for the Declaration. Was it Thomas Jefferson or was it John Adams? And I suppose, gun to your head, you always have to say Jefferson since he wrote the darn thing. But there is a sense in which I think we can wrongly assume that this is a wholly, let's say, innovative document. And a radical appears in the title of your book, so maybe you might have some quibbles with that idea. But I'm just curious. How would you say that? How would you, was it innovative? Was it simply taking ideas that were already in the ether? Like, what exactly did Jefferson do?
Right. No, good, Josh. Thank you. Hans is a good friend of mine. I've known Hans for 30 years at this point. He's great, and I love his book. He's a great scholar. I would actually agree with him from the way you just presented it. I think that when Jefferson is asked, right, he's asked in May of 1825. He's 14 months away from death. He doesn't know that, but he's a
Yeah.
very old man. It's 49 years after the Declaration, so his memory is probably not perfect. And plus, he's elderly, so he's probably also not perfect in memory. But when he is asked by Robert E. Lee's father, what gave you the impetus to write the Declaration of Independence? He said, well, these were the common sense. It was the common sense of the subject, right? In terms put so plain and firm as to command their assent. There was nothing original in the Declaration. Instead, it was the common sense of the subject, what every American already believed. But it was the ideas of Aristotle, Cicero, Sidney, and Locke. And that would have been, to say that in 1825 is shorthand. That would be as if you asked me, Josh, what do you teach at Hillsdale? I would say, well, we start with Genesis, and then we go to Socrates, and then we go to Cicero, and then we go to St. Augustine, what I'm doing is giving a lineage. And that's so we can look at those four figures that Jefferson brings up, but it's more important to look at the lineage. That
Right.
is, he's basically saying this is a document of Western civilization. And you'll remember he's not Christian, but there are many, many Christian elements within the Declaration of Independence. And it would have to be for a Protestant audience. It would just have to be for him
Hmm.
to command that assent. It would have to resonate with that audience. And so, one of the things I tried to do in the book, and I had a lot of fun with this, I actually broke down what I thought Jefferson was taking from those four figures and what kind of emphasis they would have. And I'm most interested in Cicero out of those guys. I'm least interested in John Locke. So there's a little bit of bias. I don't consider myself a huge Locke fan. He hated Catholics, and I'm okay with that. It's just he's not that great to me. Whereas I know he's important, though, and I would be foolish not to recognize his importance for Jefferson and for others. So I had a blast looking at what Aristotle and Cicero would have given, and I'm pretty convinced, though I could be in a minority about this, and I could be wrong as well, but I'm pretty convinced that Jefferson's change from Locke, that is, from life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I think that's an Aristotelian moment. Because if you go to book 10 of the Ethics, one of the books Jefferson would have known, he would have known Cicero much better. That the Americans knew the Roman Latin writers
Right.
much better than they knew the Greek writers. And yeah, that was just a part of the culture at the time. But when he looks at Pursuit of Happiness, Aristotle had said in book 10 that, and it's one of the only times Aristotle mentions God, he says that when we pursue excellence, we are pursuing our happiness because God has given us these talents and we give them back to him. And so to pursue one's happiness is not to veg on Netflix, right? That's not what it means. It means truly, well, I would say this, Josh, it's what we've been doing for the last 50 minutes. We have been pursuing our happiness. We
Hmm.
are trying to get to serious things. We're not ideologues. We're trying to be scholarly about this. We're trying to give past judgment without being judgmental. We are doing something that I would say is good and high. It's a conversation. It's a conversation between friends and allies. And yet we can disagree, and that's healthy too. And so that's the kind of thing that I think is really important. So, we could put this in the terms that St. Paul would have said. Look at the body of Christ. The ear is not the foot, but they both really matter.
Hmm.
Well, I'm not a great tennis player. In fact, I'm terrible at it. But I'm really happy with my teaching. It doesn't mean I'm always great or I'm always perfect, but I'm satisfied with it. It's a good satisfaction. It's not the satisfaction of binge watching Netflix. It's something that says, yeah, I made a difference today. And so I love that idea in Jefferson. It's basically thanking God for the gifts he's given us. And that to me, that's so much better than property. And I'm all in favor of ownership of property, of course. I mean, again, I'm a conservative, I'm a libertarian. I believe we should own property. I believe we should own property in ourselves. But for Jefferson to have changed that to pursuit of happiness, Love that. It's basically saying, as Americans, we believe in excellence, right? Not mediocrity, but excellence. And I love that. But the other thing I really stressed was Cicero. And I think as Americans, we forget how important Cicero was, not only to the Republic, the Roman Republic, but to the American Republic.
Hmm.
Cicero is everywhere. You can't pick Benjamin Rush up. You can't pick Thomas Jefferson, John Adams without Cicero being everywhere. And we have to remember, Cicero was a martyr. He was killed by Mark Antony for the Republic.
Yeah.
Now, that's not as high as being a martyr for Christianity, obviously, but it's not low either.
Yeah.
No, it's a beautiful thing that he gave his life for the Republic. And that's not lost on the American founders. They see themselves literally picking up the body of Cicero and breathing new life in him with the foundation of the American Republic. And I love that image, right? I mean, we've got the ghost of Cicero. He's our guiding spirit in all of this, along, of course, with the Holy Trinity. So again, I'm not equating them, but there
Right.
are all
Right.
these various things that go into it. And so, we often, and Josh, I love telling audiences this, you know, we think about schooling, right? And we think that we learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. But if this were 1750 and you were 8, 9, or 10 years old, and you went to school for, say, 3 years before you had to work full time on the farm, the only thing you learned as an 8-year old, a 9-year old, and a 10-year old was Greek and Latin. That is the
Mm.
only thing that was taught in schools. And so every American had 2 to 3 years of Latin, and they had gotten it as a little kid. And again, we forget this. Very few French, who were our allies, spoke English, and almost no Americans spoke French. And so almost all the battle orders that went forth at a place like Yorktown, they were all in Latin because that was the
Wow.
only common language we had with the French. So, and it's a world that's so lost to us.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just so far gone from our understanding of what education is. But that was the world of the founding. So again, deeply Protestant and deeply classical.
Yeah. No, that yeah, deeply classical. Also, as you had painted, the world of the founding was one where people declared 75 separate independences from Great Britain prior to the actual official independence. It, it's, it, I think it's helpful to put yourself in the mindset of what those people were like and what they thought and what they read and how they processed information before we can critique or properly judge were they right and and what they did.
Yeah,
I would love to ask you so much more, but I'm going to ask a concluding question here.
sure.
This and I'll forewarn you, this conversation is going to we're recording prior to our 250th celebration, July the
Right.
4th. It's going to drop after that. Although I'm of the opinion that I think every red-blooded American needs to be finding some way to celebrate for the year.
Me too.
This is the
Me too.
inauguration is the 4th, not the culmination.
Yes,
Um,
I like that.
and so let me ask you, because I will also admit that I am not I fall prey to this too, what I'm about to describe. I get a sense that there's a good many Americans who are trapped in the binary nature of our politics. And everything has been collapsed down to pro or anti-Trump or pro or
Mm,
anti-MAGA or the resistance. And I think that people, I think, out of good faith will argue those positions. I'm not trying to say it's wholesale wrong
sure.
or right, but I think that it can kind of cloud one's vision of a 250-year site, if you will, or 250 years vision is what we want to have in mind, not the last couple of years or whatever Trump tweets tomorrow.
Right.
What would you say to Americans then of all stripes, be they liberal, be they conservative, be they Democrat or Republican, left or right? What is a proper way to celebrate this 250 years? What is a proper mindset to have over this next year as we try to hold in our hearts and minds what it means to have accomplished a quarter of a millennia of this great
Yeah.
American experiment?
Well, I would never, ever want to whitewash our history. I think we have to recognize that there are peoples that we have not treated well. And we've done everything from enslaving to taking land. And those are hard things, right? And again, as a Catholic, I mean, you got to confess. You don't forget your sin. You go and you confess it and you try and do better. And you don't forget your sin, but you don't dwell on it either. You recognize it and you move on. And I think that's really important for us, whether we're Catholic or not. I just think it's a great kind of way of thinking. And so I would say this, and I'm old enough, Josh. I know I'm a lot older than you. I'm 58. I was 8 during the bicentennial. So I remember it. It was, I grew up
You're
in a
not
small
that
Kansas.
much older than me, but thank you.
Oh, okay. All right. I look a lot older than you. You look a lot younger. But I remember very well in my small Kansas town how much, and this was after the defeat in Vietnam. This is after Watergate. The economy is horrible in
Yeah.
1976. But I remember my neighborhood, we just came together and we celebrated. And it was days of celebration. And one of my neighbors was walking around giving spontaneous orations and reading from the Declaration. And it wasn't cheesy. It was meaningful. We really, really meant it. And I think we should feel that way this year. I don't see any reason, despite our sins as Americans, which we all need to acknowledge, I see no reason not to look at the Declaration of Independence and look at that sentence. We hold these truths to be self evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I would go this far. I actually believe that is the single finest non scriptural sentence in human history.
Mm,
I think that statement, it is a sequel to St. Paul telling us there is neither male nor female, neither Greek nor Jew. Christianity got there first. There's no question about that. And we could never have had the Declaration without Christianity, even though Jefferson himself is not very Christian. But it would not have existed without that. But when Jefferson says we hold these truths, again, as Calvin Coolidge said, that's final. And the only thing we can do from that point forward is make it real. And I feel very strongly that those words have changed the world. And it would not matter if I am a Black Somali Muslim woman in St. Paul, Minnesota. I have benefited both from St. Paul and from the Declaration of Independence. I think every human being on this planet has benefited from the statement of the Declaration. Remember, the Declaration is not about Americans, it's about humans. It's about all human beings, past, present, future, there, here, everywhere. It is a universal statement, and that gives it a raw power. It's not crazy. It's not ideological. It's a statement of human dignity. And I love that. And I think we as Americans, and again, this is why going all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, Josh, there's Jefferson, slaveholder who made a sentence that wiped out slavery. What do you do with that? I mean, it's a paradox, it's ironic, it's a tension, and yet it's real. And I have to say that whatever Jefferson's other sins, he covered over a multitude of them with this document. And so the fact that Congress had the foresight to pass it, that Congress bettered the document in some ways, it also worsened it in the way dealing with slavery, but
mhm.
it bettered it when it said, and we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor under divine providence. It made it a covenant. So it's no longer just a
Yeah.
political document, it's a religious document, and a
Mhm.
very serious religious document where they put their lives on the lines. So, no, I really think we should be proud of that. And I think there's still a long way to go. If we look at the history of blacks and whites, it was bad, and then it got better, and then it got worse again, and then it got better. And in 2026 it's not perfect, but it's a lot better than 100 years ago or 200 years ago. The one place I feel very strongly that we have failed is with the American Indian. You
Mm,
drive on to the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, you have 90% poverty and 90% alcoholism. We have not brought
mm.
equality to them. We have not brought dignity to the American Indian. And I think that's something that we as Americans still really have to deal with. We drive into a black neighborhood like East St. Louis, it's 30% poverty, but it's not 90. And
Mhm.
that I think really does, I think it speaks to me, and I think it should speak to us that we've got a ways to go. And there's that one group, and I think they're the only group that's been utterly disadvantaged by the American experiment, but it needs to be made right. And I don't know how to do that. I don't have a solution, but somehow it needs to be made right. And so that's where I see us now. So 95% good, 5% still a problem, but we should still be really proud because I think even if we can solve the American Indian poverty problem, it'll be done because of the Declaration and what that promise was.
Your passion is infectious, so I appreciate that, Zil, and I think it's an excellent answer, beautifully stated, beautifully written book. Again,
Thank
try to
you.
get it up here on the camera. The Declaration of Independence, a radical experiment in liberty. Dr. Bradley Birzer, get it where fine books are sold. Brad, it has been too long since we've had you on.
It was great, Josh. I loved it.
Yeah.
You got me so worked up. I don't know if I'm going to be able to sleep tonight.
That's what I try to do.
These ideas running through my head. Oh, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.